Jafro, that looks stupid. What on earth are you doing? In order to move forward on my build, I'm finding myself having to make some of the necessary tools. This is a $7 24mm socket from my local hardware store. I've never been able to find the $70 slotted socket number MD998773-24, so I figured I'd make one. After breaking the fourth drill bit attempting to drill a pretty hole, I decided to go with fast and easy. Unfortunately, yes, that means she's going to be ugly, but try to follow. Many of you know what this is at a glance. The rest of you can pause it. Compared to all the others out there, this one's cheap, and instead of breaking $38 worth of drill bits over nothing, this hole is free. My favorite kind, so if you need a cheap quickie, this is what it lets you do. Stop it with the drilling and the cutting wheels if ugly is what you need. Plasma cutters are pretty awesome. Man, that looks just like my MD998773-27. I can't tell the difference. You see that? They're the same, straight as an arrow. I'm going to clean this up, and it's exactly what I need to get done. It just takes a tiny fraction of a kilowatt hour and some compressed air to cut high carbon steel like butter. That's the first time I've ever used one of these things. Sorry I'm late. I really like it. When you install the knock sensor, the factory service manual says it requires 17 pounds of torque, or 23 newton meters. It's in a dry hole. The factory service manual does not say anything about applying oil, grease, thread locker, Teflon tape, or any kind of sealant, so don't. All those things would affect its torque load or make it less sensitive. In order for it to work without false positives or false negatives, you just use a specific torque. This one's 24 millimeters, so your O2 sensor socket won't work here. Using a crow's foot socket might make the wrench go click, but a crow's foot socket will affect the torque load applied to the sensor. You'd have to compensate for that. With a socket like this, you don't need to do any math, and you'll easily get the right torque without damaging the connector. I just saved myself $64. I couldn't find my intake manifold gasket anywhere, so I ordered another one. No, that's not it. I'm looking for an intake manifold gasket. Pro tip, if you can't find a part, buy another one and you'll find it immediately afterwards. Uh-oh, busted, you don't see that. Nothing here to see, people, move along. Next, I want to prepare the head for an intake manifold. I pulled the studs out of it to make things easier on myself during the port job, and they need to go back on first. The flange was already cleaned up by the machine shop, and that's nice. I don't have to do that. But once the studs are in, I can hang this brand new gasket on it. Even if the flange is clean, before you install your intake manifold gasket, wipe down the flange surface with alcohol or an acetone-based cleaner to remove any dust or foreign material. I'm just using the standard OEM turbo intake manifold gasket on this build. Let's go pick out a manifold from the turbo pile. Hold on. It's on the bottom of the pile. I need to brace this with something. Oh, here, perfect. Another exhaust manifold. That'll hold it up. I'm going to stay with the ugly one I've got. I don't know, it's a little unstable. Better add another manifold just to be safe. I don't want to destabilize the turbo pile. You can never be too careful with your turbo pile. Seriously, for the intake manifold, I have no need to change from the one I've got. Everything I need is still bolted to it. It's a 1G turbo intake manifold with big ol' runners and a big ol' non-turbo throttle body, and it isn't going to be a restriction at all. I may change the throttle body elbow, but once again, ugly is perfect for this car. Aside from scraping the gasket off the flange, I'm not even going to clean it. I want every bit of the dirt, grime, stains, chipping, flaking paint, and riciness that I can possibly have on this car. It's a character trait, not a defect. This thing's going on the Hyundai after all, not my Veyron. The metal gasket works beautifully, you just have to do a little bit more prep work. Hang the manifold off the nuts until you get your bolts straight. The bolts for a factory DSM intake manifold are a very specific length. They're grade 7 M8 by 28 bolts with a 1.25mm thread pitch and assembled lock washers. If you use a heat barrier gasket, you need to obtain different length bolts prior to your assembly. The torque rating on the bolts is dependent on how many threads deep the intake manifold bolts go. So you'd add the thickness of your heat barrier gasket to determine the bolt lengths that you need. You'll find that fitting a torque wrench in here is extremely difficult because of the parts like the coil pack being in your way or because the bolts and nuts are in an awkward location. The intake manifold bolts get between 11 and 14 pounds of torque. Torque the anchor nuts on the sides to 30 foot-pounds. I'm pretty much done installing the intake manifold for now. I can put the coil pack back on and permanently install the plug wires and be captivated by the beauty of this artfully crafted masterpiece. Now for the coolant system. I've got a few parts to clean up, and they're not as dirty as they are corroded. I don't want to remove any of that corrosion, but I don't want anything oily on them, so I'm using mineral spirits with a siphon feed blowgun to degrease them. This really does an amazing job, but I still need to remove the old gasket. That's got to go. Whenever you're using a scraper like this, it's important that you not put any part of yourself in front of the blade. Hold the part behind where you're scraping to avoid emergency room visits. Some people use a Scotch-Brite pad with a die grinder, but it's not my preference on delicate aluminum parts. Sure, it takes a lot longer with a razor blade and a handle, but it doesn't round the corners of the flange. Next, I give the thermostat flange on the cylinder head the exact same treatment. Then I install the gasket and the thermostat housing. There isn't a factory 13mm nut or bolt anywhere on a DSM, but one came off of it when I took it apart, and I'm proud to put it right back on there to confuse the next person who takes this thing apart. The thermostat housing nuts all get 13 pounds of torque. I made a change both to the oil and the cooling systems on this go-around. I installed a modified water-cooled oil filter housing from a 1G turbo car because I felt it was appropriate. I noticed one of the nipples was bent on it, so I simply used a screwdriver to gently pry it back into place. Now it's time for me to be a hoser. I'm using all new factory hoses here because I want these parts to fit correctly and look as stock as possible. But because it's clearly not a showroom fresh build in a Hyundai, I'm using cheap, ugly worm gear clamps instead of the factory spring clamps. These actually seal better, but I like them because they're not as tidy. The hoses I bought for the throttle body aren't correct for this throttle body. They're for a 91 turbo and the outlets don't line up perfectly. Only one really fit. But what are you going to do? One still fit with a little bit of persuasion and didn't kink. And the other one, I'm just going to cut a piece of this used heavy-duty coolant hose that was already here. Now I want to focus on some other regular maintenance items. We've got a PCV valve here, and that's easy enough to replace. Be gentle, it's a valve cover. Another thing I prefer to do on the block instead of on the bench is the thermostat. Because the housing is securely bolted to the block here and it's easily accessible, I prefer this because it prevents me from chasing it all over my workbench. Clean the thermostat housing however you see fit, just don't remove any aluminum. I'm using the OE thermostat and of course the gasket that comes in the kit. I should really work with a service manual next to me, but I didn't. The thermostat housing bolts get 14 foot-pounds, but I underachieved here at 13. It'll be fine. The second to last order of business for the coolant system is a stamped 11227 radiator cap. This is a 13-pound standard cap. It doesn't just offer peace of mind, it offers a nice cheap aftermarket appearance. I'm using the stock center section for a 1G car on this build, and it's oiled and water cooled. But before I go digging through this pile of used turbos to get the parts I'm going to use, I'm going to clean every last one of them so that I don't get filthy in the process, because I want the goop out of these oil galleries that's been lingering around here from previous builds on other cars. Next we've got my old Big 16G that was on the GSX prior to the 20G install. Not a thing in the world wrong with this turbo. Then there's this 14B that was on the Hyundai. The coolant lines on it, they're actually the original ones off my GSX. And they've been bent all over the place and used in 4 different turbos. I want to strip all the parts off of it, short of the O2 housing, and clean it up for storage. Finally, we've got the old $224 Chinese eBay knockoff TD05H20G. Everything but the O2 housing has to come off of this thing. It still has a brand new 2G O2 sensor in it from the GSX. That's got to come out too. I blew the motor in the car this thing was on, and it wasn't this turbo's fault. I don't have very many miles on this stuff at all, but none of it's going back on the GSX. However, because this turbo was used on the GSX, that makes it a used part. This is the turbo I'm going to put into service on the Hyundai. This is really going to be fun. This is going to be a pretty big behavior modifier for this little car. This 20G flows around 650 CFM. DSM Link version 2 on my GSX measured 47 pounds per minute of airflow at 26 psi. A 14B flows around 405 CFM, good for 270 to 300 horsepower, around 21 psi with an otherwise stock turbo engine. Including all of the modifications and adjustments I've made to correct this engine's shortcomings over the past dozen videos, I may very well be doubling the output of this engine if I can get it to flow like it did on the GSX, but keep it from knocking. Prior to the 20G upgrade on the GSX, I ran this Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Big 16G. You can identify this one by the inlet size and the blade configuration. The most airflow I ever got out of this thing was 42 pounds a minute at 25 psi. Because I achieved only 5 pounds a minute more airflow with this 20G compressor wheel crammed into the exact same size compressor housing, I'm of the opinion that yes, it's an upgrade. You'll probably see it on a dyno chart. It's slightly laggier by about 200 RPMs though, so the extra 5 pounds a minute of airflow I managed to achieve with it never really turned into anything different on a time slip. I would call the last two turbos equals. If we look at the differences in these housings, you'll notice some of the other changes to this build. The turbo that was originally on the car had a stock 6cm exhaust housing. Both the spare 14B and my 16G have 6cm housings ported to 7cm at the exhaust inlet. The eBay 20G we're using has an unported 7cm housing. It came that way. I believe the biggest limiting factor in the TDO 5H series turbos is the small size of the compressor and exhaust housings. I think this 20G wheel and a TDO 5H compressor housing is a little bit too big for its own good. But I only paid $224 for the TDO 520G versus the $700 for a new original MHI Big 16G without the exhaust housing. I still have no real data regarding its durability, but it did manage to outlast the last engine it was bolted to and come out of it unscathed. Both of them did, actually. Now let's look at the exhaust manifolds that were in the pile. First up is a plain old stock unported 1G turbo manifold. You can see the step in the flange for the compression ring gasket. Next we have a 2G turbo exhaust manifold, and this one wasn't ported very well. The port went no further than the step ring as indicated by the blackened ring around where the gasket was, and too much of the center divider was removed from this one. I have another 2G manifold with a better expression. Cutting too much of the divider out is a bad thing because of your firing order. The pulses of the exhaust stroke bounce off of that divider down into the turbo inlet instead of flowing back into the other runners, helping the turbo to spool more efficiently. This one was done properly, but doing this shortens the lifespan of the manifold because it makes it more prone to cracking from the inside out. Last up, we have a forced performance race manifold. These huge runners are shaped and tuned to point down into the turbo inlet. It has a completely different design. I had it ceramic coated, but I don't think I got the temperature range of the coating right because this one needs work. It's starting to flake off inside the runners. To easily identify which manifold you have, you can look for one simple identifying feature. There's a hump on the number 1 runner of the 2G manifold that makes it a dead giveaway. The 1G manifold doesn't have this feature. The outside bolt holes are also 2 millimeters bigger on the 2G flange. But if it's bolted onto the car, you won't be able to see that. 1G manifolds are prone to cracking even if they're not ported. 2G manifolds are more resistant to this because they have a thicker casting. If you're lucky, the outside of your exhaust manifold looks like this, because these are far less likely to ever have this problem. But that's enough silliness for one workbench. It's time to grab all the pieces I'm going to use and turn them all into one part. I want to use standard unmolested coolant lines for the best possible fit and the most stock appearing finish. I like the slightly corroded finish of these parts for this build, so I'm not going overboard cleaning this up. I'm just cleaning up what's important. The banjo bolt has a ton of calcium built up, and I'll remove what I can get to, but trying to remove all of it is wasted effort because it's the Hyundai and because it's all going to come right back. After torquing the coolant banjo bolt down to 31 foot-pounds, I'm happy with how this looks. Of course, when it's mounted on the car, it's sandwiched between the turbo and the block, so it will be impossible to see it, but I just wanted all the coolant lines to be located in the factory locations and to have it fit all the other factory parts. Here's the 7cm gasket that fits this 20G we're using. I'm quickly going to clean up the gasket surface, and then we're going to pick out a manifold. I'm not using the FP race manifold on the Hyundai because I want to be able to install a factory heat shield, and because I feel like the runners on it are a little bit too big for such a restrictive tiny little TDO 5H turbo exhaust housing. That one's too small and has a bad port job. That one's way too small for this turbo. This one's the winner. We're going to use the well-ported 2G manifold. Now for a quick cleanup, and we're going to bolt it to the block. I I have an old Felpro gasket that needs to be used because it's been sitting here on my shelves for years waiting for the right car to bolt it to. I've also had this random aftermarket set of copper M8 lock nuts looking for work. These studs can grow brittle from heat and corrosion, so you want to use hand tools to run the nuts down and make sure there are no damaged threads. The studs are installed in a soft aluminum head. They're never supposed to see very much torque. Using power tools here could break studs or strip out the threads of the head. But even when you use this level of caution, you can still break studs or strip threads, as many people have testified to in the forums. Once the nuts are snugged, set your favorite torque wrench to 20 foot-pounds and torque down each nut from the inside of the flange to the outside edges. Crap, this stud won't get any tighter. Closer inspection reveals tightening this nut is extracting both the stud and the threads that are supposed to stay inside the head. This is exactly what you don't want to have happen, and it happens to the best of us. At least I get to show you how to fix it. Fortunately, it's not the center hole because that hole is shared with an oil gallery. Drilling and tapping the center hole may leave metal inside your crankcase if you're not creative. This one doesn't go all the way through. Pick up a thread repair kit from your local or your online auto parts store. This kit's under 30 bucks and it was mail ordered. It comes with a tap, installer tool, and 3 inserts. The installer tool can double as a tap handle. After you have the tap and the installer, you can buy these thread inserts dirt cheap. The concept is simple for these thread repair kits. You drill a bigger hole, tap it, then install thread inserts to fill in the gap. When you're done, you should have the same size hole that the part originally had in it, but stronger because the outside of the thread inserts have more surface area where they're contacting the part, and they're not made of aluminum. This would have been a lot more fun to do on the workbench, and I should have paid more attention and taken more time to align both the drill and the tap here. I was a little bit off kilter, but even a crooked install is better than leaving a stud out because you can't get it to bite. If you don't have every single exhaust manifold stud in place and torqued evenly, you will have an exhaust leak, and it will decrease the efficiency of your turbocharger, resulting in lost performance. Stripped threads here aren't the end of the world. They don't ruin the head. They're easy to fix, and if this happens to you, just stop what you're doing and don't finish the build and drive the car around. Get the repair kit and fix the threads, because it'll ruin your exhaust manifold gasket, forcing you to have to take the whole hot side back off to replace it. It will also affect your O2 readings, leading to an incorrect fuel mixture and your car won't run right. But now that that's taken care of, let's get back on track with the 20G install. On a 1G, all 9 nuts get 20 foot-pounds. On a 2G, the outside M10 nuts get 21 foot-pounds and the center ones get 19. I always use new OEM spring washers and turbo bolts to avoid having the turbo come loose or breaking bolts off in the exhaust housing. There's a specific method to installing these correctly, and I've covered it in other videos. You place both spring washers on the turbo bolt with the dimples facing out. If you don't do it this way, you stand a much greater chance of breaking bolts either while you're torquing them down, while you're driving the car, or when you're taking the thing back apart again later. They offer a little bit of flexibility and preload here for thermal expansion, so that your turbo bolts don't become loose when the engine is hot. The torque sequence is listed differently for 1G and 2G cars, even though all the part numbers are exactly the same. The 1G method says to just use 43 foot-pounds. We'll see how this turns out. With the turbo torque down, I just need to finish up the coolant and the oil line installations. The coolant line banjo bolts both get 31 foot-pounds. The oil feed line gets 22 foot-pounds on the turbo side. Don't forget your crush washers here. They aren't fun to install once you've got the engine in the car and the fluids topped off. My oil feed line has seen better days. It's been bent a few times and I had to monkey with it to get it to fit right again. It's not the turbo's fault here. The eBay 20G seems to fit a 1G6 bolt much better than it does on the 2G7 bolt, because the 1G cars came with MHI turbos already, and they already have all the inlets and outlets in the right sizes and places to simply bolt right up. Finally, the last coolant hose. This completes the coolant line replacements until the engine gets installed. All that's left to hook up on the coolant system now are the heater and the radiator hoses when the engine goes back in the car. Even though I'm putting the heat shield back on it right now, we're not finished with the turbo install just yet. We still need an oil return line. I'm using the stock line with new OEM gaskets, bolts, and washers. Aside from the oil return line itself, these are all single-use parts, including the bolts. Failure to replace these with new parts inevitably leads to oil leaks. It's not hard to replace if it's just the gasket leaking, but it's never a fun job once the engine's back in the car and your fluid levels are topped off. The bolts corrode, and the ones for the turbo are aluminum, making them prone to snapping off in the turbo center section. They're only supposed to see 7 pounds of torque. It's best to just plan ahead and buy these parts in advance so you don't have to deal with any of this later. I also like to replace the oil plug and the gasket with a new one. Some people do that with every single oil change, and I find that excessive. Dipstick. Don't forget to torque the oil feed line bolt down to 14 foot-pounds. I left that out earlier. Time for the O2 sensor install, and yes, I use anti-seize. These things get torqued to 33 foot-pounds. They will leak, fail, or be nearly impossible to remove if you don't hit that torque load. I'm running out of parts to bolt onto this thing. It feels really good to be at this stage of the game. Just a crank pulley, some random plate that I don't recognize and I have no idea where it goes, a throwout bearing, some fuel rail bolts, O-ring, new clutch bolts, exhaust gasket, and oh, hey, here's that intake manifold gasket I was looking for. Sure glad I found that one now that I've bought another one and finished assembling the engine. I can't install the engine right now because some changes to the chassis are being made. So I'm plugging up all the holes to keep them clear of the bugs and the debris and kicking around my garage to find anything else that I can bolt onto this engine. There, I think that's about it. Now you see me build something ugly. What we've ended up with here is a 9.4:1 dynamic compression ratio 2-liter dual overhead cam engine that has no engine code because this head was never bolted to this block in any Mitsubishi or Hyundai configuration. It looks exactly like a stock 4G63 engine. Even the turbo looks correct because the 20G wheel is crammed into the exact same TD05H housing that the 14B wheel came wrapped in. You'd have to either be a subscriber or really be paying attention to know any different. Even the cam gears, which were previously exposed, I've hidden under a complete upper and lower timing cover. There's only one non-stock looking part on the outside of this whole engine, and that's the dumped O2 housing with a Bosch O2 sensor hanging off of it. If anyone asks me in person, I'm telling them it's stock. Why ruin the surprise? Thanks for following along on this build and for everything you all do here on Jafromobile. I'll be back soon with another episode, and until then, stay tubed.